Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Echoes from the Bog, your favorite peatland podcast. In this episode, we will continue our slow submersion into peatlands across Europe, this time with a visit, in the form of 3 interviews, to the peatlands of Germany. Like most peatlands across Europe, Germany's peatlands have a long history of being altered by human intervention. Germany was once a very bog-rich country with peatlands covering an area roughly the size of Saxony. Once sprawling, largely impenetrable, and sometimes containing peat up to 8 meters thick, peatlands now cover only approximately 3.5% of Germany's land area. Best estimates suggest that up to 96% of German peatlands are currently drained, with approximately 86% used for agriculture and 10% used for forestry. To unknowing eyes, most of this land is not even recognizable as a former peatland, and despite their utility, it is these drained and damaged peatlands that alone account for 7% of Germany's national greenhouse gas emissions. But how did we get here? Though widespread drainage began in the 18th century, it is documented that Cistercian monks participated in annual small-scale drainage activities as early as the 13th century. But drainage ramped up and became a large-scale project in the 18th century under Prussian King Friedrich II, when orders for peatland cultivation colonized many of these ecosystems due to scarcity of wood and an attempt to make the land usable. Drainage ramped up once again in the 19th century due to the proliferation of more technical approaches exported by Dutch experts in peatland management that we might more accurately call drainage or destruction. And finally, the history of German peatland drainage reached its most dramatic stage after World War II, when all available land was put to use and extremely intensive drainage measures were put into place to allow large-scale farming on peatlands, taking place mostly in the 1960s. This brings us to our present moment, where in some areas with long agricultural histories, such as the northeast German state of Mecklenburg-West Pomerania along the Baltic coast, drained peatlands make up to 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions for the region. Yet despite the storied past and the state of contemporary widespread drainage, things are shifting in the German story of peatland relations, thanks to creative strategies for land reclamation and widespread paludiculture attempts. Because many of the peatlands in Germany that are potentially re-wettable are already used for agriculture, paludiculture offers a viable solution for retaining the agricultural use value of peatlands while also improving the health of these ecosystems for all. Paludiculture allows farmers to continue to use the land for agricultural purposes, even as the land is re-wet, so emissions are lowered and agricultural sacrifices are minimized. Aside from paludiculture strategies, Germany is also a worldwide leader in making land swap deals with stakeholder farmers. For instance, in these same areas near the Baltic coast with drained peatlands that inevitably emit enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, farmers are being encouraged to re-wet their former peatlands, receiving compensation in the form of access to public lands elsewhere. It is estimated that with these schemes and with the cooperation of farmers, local governments have been able to re-wet about 5,000 acres of peatlands per year. This is a fantastic step in the right direction, especially considering that changing relationships to peatlands is absolutely necessary if Germany is going to meet its goal of cutting net greenhouse gas emissions to zero before 2050. Yet, 5,000 acres a year may not be enough. Franziska Tanneberger, director of the Greifswald Mire Center, estimates that to meet this goal, Germany would have to re-wet more than 100,000 acres of peatland per year. Nevertheless, we remain encouraged by the varied and creative strategies that Germany is attempting in order to change national relations with these indispensable ecosystems. With this brief overview, we will turn to our interviews to hear some personal stories rooted deep within the German peat. Laisa Cordis' story. To start off, could you introduce yourself and share a bit about your background, especially how your connection to German peatlands began? Was there a moment, memory, or a project that really sparked your interest?
Yes, hi, my name is Laisa. I'm from Germany, but my master's studies brought me to Italy, where I've been living now for the past 2 years. My background is in design, and I just completed my master's in eco-social design here in Bolzano in South Tyrol. And okay, so it's always a bit tricky to explain exactly what eco-social design is, but basically we focus on social or ecological issues and use design more as a tool to visualize important topics, raise awareness, or bring people together. So projects in eco-social design are often interdisciplinary and start with a long research phase. So the design outcome can really be anything in the end: an exhibition, a video product, a workshop, a platform, whatever fits the findings from the research. And this master program also connected me more deeply with the topic of peatlands. But actually, there was also an earlier experience with this landscape that came back to me when I started thinking about my thesis topic. And that experience was in Germany. So about 4 years ago, a friend of mine approached me about a project, and this was a collaboration with a photographer who was publishing a book on German peatlands. My friend was designing and doing the layout for this book, while I added some illustrations. And I learned a lot about the fascinating inhabitants of this ecosystem that I was drawing. And after the book was printed and published, I felt really more connected to the landscape, and I was curious to meet its inhabitants in real life. So my friend and I went on a trip together, and we visited a raised bog in Niedersachsen. We really walked for hours on a small path, watched birds through binoculars, took pictures of the vegetation that we recognized, and listened to the silence of the area. But when we had reached about the center of the area, suddenly a huge brown surface opened up in front of us. And this was really the first time I saw a peat mining site. And after discovering this deep bond with the landscape, I felt shocked and confused. Because in the book, with its beautiful images, peatlands were depicted as romantic landscapes. And of course, I knew about the extraction of peat, but I had no idea how that actually looked. So I would say that this moment really stuck with me and definitely affected me.
How would you describe your relationship with peatlands today, both personally and professionally? What kind of work do you do with or for peatlands, and how does that relate to your role as an eco-social designer?
So my relationship with peatlands has deepened a lot over the past few years, and honestly, it's hard to separate from the personal from the professional because they've influenced each other a lot. After 1 year of research now, I would say that I feel a strong sense of empathy for the ecosystem. I'm also really enthusiastic about it, and I keep seeing connections everywhere. And I've heard the same thing from others working on this topic. I found this quite interesting because peatlands are actually inaccessible for humans. So, how do you build a relationship with something you can't easily access? And for me, there was always a lot of curiosity. Of course, to do a project on peatlands, I first needed to understand it. And now I feel like I do understand a lot, but I'm still curious. Because there are still so many open questions, and it feels like learning about peatlands is quite an endless process. So, what do I actually do as an eco-social designer? For my thesis, I worked very locally on the issue of peat extraction in this region. And there's a nearby valley that used to be entirely covered by peatlands in the past, but it was drained and a lot of peat has been extracted. And it is also still extracted today. I discovered this, and after visiting different peatland areas, I started interviewing many people. And what I found was a tense conflict between environmentalists, extraction companies, farmers, politicians, activists, and residents. And the discussion wasn't just about the past and present, but there was also a lot of insecurities on the future. Because since peat extraction is expected to be banned soon here, the question arose: what should be done with the lands, especially former extraction sites or areas that still contain peat soil? And while interviewing different stakeholders, I then started using design as a tool to support dialogue. I visualized maps, created a booklet, illustrated an animation, and designed future scenarios, all based on what I learned in the interviews. It was really an interesting process because as a designer, I was perceived as quite neutral and unbiased, which helped me speak with many different people. I was like sort of in the middle, collecting knowledge and perspectives. But I didn't want to keep that knowledge to myself. So I wanted to share it and spark more dialogue. And that's why, in the end, I created an exhibition in a nearby village close to the peat extraction areas. It was a participatory exhibition, so people could interact with the materials, write their thoughts and their own future scenarios, and join workshops to discuss ideas. And many people from different backgrounds participated. At the end of the project, I wrote and designed a report that was shared with all participants, institutions, and stakeholders. And I hope that in this way, the dialogue on this, really important topic for the region continues.
You're originally from Germany, but now based in Italy. Has this shift in landscape and culture influenced how you think about design, ecology, or activism?
Yes, definitely. I noticed a huge difference between Germany and Italy when it comes to peatlands. So, in Germany, public awareness of the importance of peatlands is much more developed, I would say, but in Italy, there's really a lack of education on this topic. And most people here don't know what peat is, where it comes from, or that there are alternatives, which also aren't easily available here. And that all makes it even more necessary to start projects that addressed overlooked topics like this. But beyond that, living here and being part of this master program has really influenced the way I think. Design isn't always comfortable, especially when you're working on tense or controversial topics. And I also, had to experience that myself. And also, it's not just about designing something. There are so many roles that come with these kind of projects. And in the end, I often felt more like a mediator, and that's not such an easy role. I also experienced a strong connection between design, ecology, and activism. I don't see them so much as separate, but as interconnected. And the impact, I think, is much bigger when they work together. And fortunately, I received a lot of support from environmental and activist organizations. And yes, this always kept me going.
Looking ahead, how do you imagine your peatland activism evolving? Are there any hopes, dreams, or projects on the horizon you'd like to share?
Okay, so there's definitely still a lot to be done. First of all, I would love to see design as a discipline being included more often in ecological topics like peatlands. I experienced that, visualizations are super helpful to make current challenges and future scenarios tangible and also discussable. So I really hope for more collaborations between designers and other disciplines like scientists, not just for peatlands, but more broadly. And when it comes to peatlands more specifically, I would love to help communicate their impact more on the consumer side now. So there's currently a study happening in South Tyrol on alternatives to peat, and I would really like to help visualize those results and make them accessible. For example, starting a campaign to support garden centers and nurseries in becoming peat-free, and helping customers understand what buying peat actually means and what alternatives they have. Yes, there's so much educational work needed here, and I think design can help here. But beyond the practical design work, I also discovered my interest in writing, especially about the role of design in shaping the future of peatlands and supporting ecosocial transformation. And so right now I'm working on an academic paper with my thesis supervisors. And finally, I just wish to exchange and connect more with others, with people, projects, and regions, because I think it's amazing how much we can inspire each other and spread more peatland enthusiasm. Yes, and I'm really happy to be collaborating also with RE-PEAT on an upcoming exhibition in autumn, which will showcase different peatland projects, including mine.
Lara's story. Can you give a brief introduction to yourself, the area in Germany where you are from, and how this land shaped your interest in peatlands, and likewise, how peatlands shaped your relationship to your locality?
I am Lara-Lane and have been part of RE-PEAT for some years now. I am a writer, cultural worker, researcher, and academic and social and environmental justice activist. Or maybe, since I am living a bit more quietly these days, rather a change worker. I grew up in a small village in northern Germany called Dersau, a place between North and Baltic Sea, in a slightly hilly landscape that got its shape from the melting of ice masses at the end of the last ice age. Because of the melting ice, many lakes formed in my area. The changes in sea levels and the Baltic Sea added, the landscape has since been run through with water bodies, of which many turned into peatlands, mostly fens, throughout time. I grew up on the countryside in a working-class family. I've always been a very sensitive being. So I would say were my parents. But they never learned how to handle it in healthy relationships. What they did have to pass on as gifts, though, is walking and connecting to the more than human world for emotional support. I was extremely in love with my life in this beautiful environment I grew up in, and felt well nourished and loved by it. I also felt strongly connected to the local community, and for the community, but it's especially for my dad, there was one very important spot to go to, the Uklai Lake, a beautiful lake in the middle of the forest bordering the village. Considering the absence of spiritual practices in our area, I'd say this was the most of a church or holy place I got to know. My dad took me there a lot. Chances are high you meet him there if you can find him at home, and I go there a lot too. He told me many stories there about his childhood and our village's history. I was never super aware that this was a proper peatland, though. I'd never thought so much about peatlands. But when I turned toward climate justice activism, peatlands made their theoretical way back into my life, and I simultaneously went back to my home landscape later on because of COVID. When there, I spent so much time outside again, just like in childhood, but with a different kind of awareness. I kept connecting with the Uklai Lake again, walked past it daily, and slowly my spiritual, academic, and creative practices all started to align and connect with the peatland that had been in my life since forever. Many developments, like my interest in indigenous studies, my own desire to decolonize myself and my culture, the genocide in Palestine, and my emotional and creative engagement with my surroundings brought me closer to the Uklai Lake, and with that to the topic of local peatlands. Researching and connecting to my own heritage turned into researching local peat history. And when asking questions about the Uklai Lake, many stories were revealed to me about my ancestors and the local community. Stories about World War II came to light when I asked people if they knew whether the Uklai was a proper peatland and what it used to look like. It turned into a portal, revealing buried secrets of drowned weapons and complicity that I would have otherwise never heard of. And finally, I found living sphagnum growing on its edges. And I realized that my more than human ancestor had survived human destruction. I still pray to a living peatland.
In your research, you explore the concept of indigeneity. Can you expand upon this for those of us who might not know? How do you understand indigeneity as a Western European person committed to decolonizing climate movements, and how did it change your relationship to your home environment?
I got in touch with indigenous peoples through my work in relation to climate justice activism. The topic, of course, also comes up in critical and cultural studies and the environmental humanities, and was thus part of different spheres of my work and life. The issue with indigeneity, or the term, concept, or status of indigeneity, is that some people had to fight very hard to get legal recognition as indigenous peoples, while there being no proper definition of it. So there's always a risk of appropriation of the status. This is why I'm trying to be very careful with its usage while also still engaging with it. So I can give some definitions of what it can mean, but I'm definitely not claiming that this is the right one. So mainly, it is characterized by cultures of place-boundness that stand in opposition to settler colonialist cultures or nationalities. In such contexts, as in the US, also called Turtle Island, for example, indigenous peoples were forcefully eradicated and violently murdered by colonizers from Europe. Indigenous cultures are tied to the land they have developed from and have complex societal structures, spiritually, culturally, and politically, that work in a less oppressive and separatist way as colonizing cultures, honoring balance and integrity also with the more than human. They're also usually based on reciprocity. Colonialist or Western cultures not only separate people into racial categories related to power, but also see the human in a Western humanist way as separate from the environment. Our environment and indigenous landbound people have had to suffer under colonialist rule legitimized by a reduction of them to wilderness, the lesser human. In this way, our environmental and climatological problems and the violence indigenous peoples have had to endure have the same root causes. Climate and environmental activism can easily reproduce new colonialist structures when not making sure that environmental solutions are in integrity with the people living in and from this environment. In many cases, conservationist measures by Western countries have displaced, killed, and expropriated even more land-based people. But these are the people that take care of their environment much more than Western people have or do with conservationist measures, while simultaneously those Western people usually having caused the imbalances they try to repair with these projects that in the end can easily disrupt the human-nature relationship even more. If we want to truly repair the climate, the environment, we must repair our Western human relationship with it. And this is not done through reinforcing neo-colonialist structures, but by being accountable for our crimes, for the wounds we carry, and how that has impacted others and still does. If we want to properly repair and decolonize, we have to make sure that we do not impose and manage even more, but give back to those who have been oppressed, listen to indigenous wisdom, and make sure to repair holistically. Only caring about the climate or environment without caring about the people reproduces the very thoughts that have led to many genocides and social oppression and the destruction of the climate and environment. Protecting and working with indigenous peoples has to be part of climate and environmental activism, in my opinion, just as social justice generally has to be part of climate and environmental justice to truly repair what is broken. So how has this changed my relationship to my home environment? Well, as a German, I have always been educated to look for fascism and to dig into the past. So I look at my own heritage more critically, generally. Because of getting into the topic of indigeneity more, I at some point realized, though, that it does not feel in total alignment to only be thinking about indigeneity in a theoretical way and from the position of a white person. Indigeneity is about place-boundness. So I decided to return to myself, find the structures of oppression that I want to tackle in myself, in my own heritage and home environment. And because it always felt a bit at the brink of appropriation and extractivism to write academic papers about indigenous peoples and arts and literature and read indigenous stories from other places, I wondered if I could reconnect to some kind of local indigenous wisdom, or maybe rather pre- or anti-colonial wisdom as part of the larger healing. I personally never quite felt the allowance to consider my own ancestors indigenous. But Indigenous teachers, including Rowan White, encouraged me to look for Indigenous ancestors in my own history and locality. And so I started digging. Since there are no living Indigenous peoples in my area, and the terminology has often been abused for fascist accounts looking for essentialist Germanic ancestry, I decided to turn away from human ancestors to find possible Indigenous traces, and instead ask my more than human ancestors for help, which include my local peatlands.
You've written about understanding peatlands as ancestors. Can you explain a little how you came to relate to peatlands as more than human ancestors, and how this understanding has shaped the ways you relate to them, and perhaps more broadly, how you relate to place in general? 100,000.
Looking for possible Indigenous wisdom in my own heritage, I was glad when I found, through Indigenous wisdoms coming from other places, the allowance to take seriously what I have already always felt, that the land, and more than human, often felt more like family than humans have. I've always felt such a deep emotional, spiritual connection with the world around me, and felt so much love coming from landscapes, from the soil holding me, the sense of blossoms making me feel alive and filling my heart with a gift of beauty, the cooling waters of our lakes enwrapping me with lightness. And then, engaging with Indigenous wisdom, I got the allowance to really see them as ancestors that taught us how to be human. To quote Cherokee author and scholar Daniel Heath Justice from the book Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, we learn to be human in large part from the land and our other than human relatives. And our humanity is enhanced and enriched by actively and imaginatively engaging them again and again in respectful relationship. So to decolonize and repair the broken relationships that colonialist, imperialist, white supremacist, patriarchic, and capitalist structures have fostered, I decided to turn to my more than human ancestors that might carry the wisdom we need for repair. Since peatlands have been here since the last ice age, they most certainly taught my early ancestors how to be human. And today, having co-developed with and through human interaction, they can still teach me their wisdom and how to be human in our times. Not only do peatlands carry a wisdom inherent to themselves, like the way sphagnum grows from decay and loss, and how peatlands challenge existing binaries, but they can also maybe help me recover some of the pre-colonial or indigenous wisdom of my ancestors, as well as they can, due to their memory holding capacities, help me trace my ancestry, their relationship to the environment and each other, and how to take accountability for past mistakes today. Peatlands, as more than human ancestors that quite literally carry the promise of a livable future due to their carbon storing capacities, can help me recover the good in the past and grow from the ruins toward a better future, oriented along accountability and repair.
Judith's story. How old were you when you started developing a relationship with peatlands? How has it evolved over time?
I grew up in the direct neighborhood of an old excavated peat pit in the outskirts of Berlin, so I should probably say I developed some sort of relationship to peatlands in my childhood already. But I must have been around 20 or 21 years old when I really consciously engaged with peatlands for the first time. During my studies, I took a course in grassland ecology. It was taught by a great, enthusiastic professor. She introduced me to the science and fascination of determining grasses. During one summer semester, we visited a lot of fields and sat down and determined everything we found around ourselves. It was lovely. She also taught us that many of those fields used to have more wetland species, like sedges, cattails, and mosses, because these fields used to be fens. Around 60% of the grasslands in the region around Berlin are drained fens. That's about 180,000 hectares. This knowledge added a new layer to my perception of the landscape that I grew up in, and it sparked my curiosity for how those fields must have looked like before the ditches were dug. we started talking about those fens and how they could be restored, while still keeping it a land that the local farmers can live off. After this course, I decided I needed to learn more about peatlands for my thesis, so I reached out to a Swedish scientist and moved to Uppsala. I first did an internship in an environmental research group at the university, and then I worked there for nearly 2 years. I measured greenhouse gases from all kinds of drained peat soils and restored peatlands. I worked in a forest research station and in a lab. And eventually, I also wrote my thesis on the vegetation recovery of an excavated peatland in northern Finland. All this brought me scientifically closer to the fascinating fluctuations in emissions and appearance of peatlands. But since I joined RE-PEAT, I'm thinking more about connecting this knowledge with society through activities, art, and conversations. I'm a part of RE-PEAT since 2.5 years now, and I'm currently working on the Restoration Academy project and the Peatland Justice project.
I heard you're collecting oral history testimonies from people who live in or around German peatlands. What made you want to do this? What have you found out?
Recently, I wondered about the peat pits that are located close to my parents' house in the outer rims of Berlin. The pits were filled with water in the 90s and then turned into little ponds. I loved ice skating on them when I was a child, and I strolled through the fields and forests around it. I really wanted to know now who excavated the peat and what it was used for. So I began to reach out to municipalities, archives, and universities. Suddenly, it somehow turned out to be trickier than I thought to find information on the site and to retrace its history. So my little side research turned into a riddle and an investigation. And it didn't work only to browse archives and research on my laptop, but I needed conversations. And I needed to talk to the old neighbors and activate some local memories. I'm now following up the GDR history and its institutions that worked with the peatlands. This brings me much closer to understanding the narrative around peatlands and socialism that existed in the GDR. I'm still working on it currently, and I really hope that I'm able to bring it together for the exhibition that will happen as part of the RE-PEAT Peatland Justice project.
You're a part of the Restoration Academy project at RE-PEAT. How has this experience enriched your view on peatlands and nature restoration?
The Restoration Academy project is all about bringing youth work and nature restoration together. It sometimes feels like the practice of a win-win-win-win situation. Many people are aware that we need to strengthen our relationships to ecosystems and that we need to get restoration work done immediately to prevent more and more crises to happen in the climate and ecosystem collapse. The youth is very aware, but also deeply frustrated and terrified facing the future. Collective action and a visible and graspable impact can be so empowering in that sense. At the same time, nature restoration, especially when it comes to peatlands, needs to happen quickly, on a big scale. That requires a lot of hands. So creating spaces where young people can learn hands-on how to support ecosystems makes a lot of sense. A big learning I had during this project is that leaving disrupted ecosystems to themselves for recovery is often not the smartest solution. We sometimes need to actively undo intrusive changes humans once made to the land, and there is such a thing as a helping human hand and a positive role for humans in natural environments.
We hope these stories from Germany's peatlands have given you new insights into the layered histories and unfolding futures of these landscapes. From centuries of drainage to today's experiments in paludiculture and land-based storytelling, Germany's relationship with peat is both complex and evolving. What stood out through each of these interviews is how personal that relationship can become, how peatlands, once forgotten or unseen, can emerge as teachers, ancestors, collaborators, and companions in the work of ecological and cultural repair. Whether it's through activism, design, research, or simply walking familiar paths with new awareness, these stories remind us that reimagining our connection to land is not only necessary, it's already happening, and it's happening in the bog. If you have your own story to tell, maybe you live near a peatland, work with wet landscapes, or simply feel drawn to these ecosystems, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on Instagram at repeat.earth or send us an email at info@re-peat.earth. We're always looking for new voices, perspectives, and stories to share. Who knows, maybe you'll be featured on a future episode of Echoes from the Bog. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you down in the bog.